What is nomological harmony, and is it evidence for God? That's what we'll be discussing. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm joined once again by Dr. Brian Cutter. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Thanks for joining me again, Dr. Cutter.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I discovered a very recent paper that you had published. The paper's super interesting, and I thought I need to get you on to talk about this. So first, let's ask this: what is nomological harmony?
Good. So the fact of nomological harmony is just the fact that our universe is governed by laws that kind of match its contents. So, I'll give you some examples to explain what I mean. So, there are laws of nature that say how massive bodies should behave. And sure enough, there exist massive bodies in the universe for those laws to govern. Or there are charged particles in the universe. Those are among the contents of our universe. And sure enough, there are laws of nature specifying how charged particles are to behave. So there's a kind of match between the laws of our universe and the things in it. Or the way we put it in the paper, somewhat more precisely, is there's a match between laws and states of our universe. That is, there are states of the universe such that applying the laws to those states yields other states, kind of generates some kind of interesting temporal evolution. And we think like it didn't obviously have to be this way. So there could have been like Newtonian laws of nature that just didn't apply to the initial conditions of our non-Newtonian universe, in which case the universe would have been stillborn because the laws just like would not have engaged the initial conditions of the universe. Nothing interesting would have happened. Or the universe might have had like Newtonian initial conditions, but relativistic laws that just don't apply to those conditions. Or the universe might have had laws governing mass, but only schmassive bodies instead of massive bodies. Or the world might have had laws governing charged particles, but only schmarged particles exist. So the analogy that we kind of set up the problem with is you can think of the laws of nature as something like a rule book for a game, and the contents of the universe are like the game pieces. And rule books and game pieces could, in principle, be mismatched, right? Like you could have a box with game pieces for chess, but a rule book for checkers, or game pieces for Monopoly, but a rule book for Go. And in that case, like the rule book just wouldn't provide you any guidance for how the board should evolve from the initial conditions. So a universe with mismatched states and laws would be sort of like a game with a mismatched kind of rule book and set of game pieces. And that's kind of the fact of nomological harmony. And what we call the problem of nomological harmony is just trying to explain why our universe is like this. Why is it that the laws and the states, or the laws and the contents of our universe, match in this kind of nice harmonious way?
But one quick objection might be this: somebody might say, "Well, wait a minute. You could take a Humean view, like a non-governmental view about laws, and then the problem just goes away because on this view, there's no laws that are governing what states do, what matter does. States and matter, you could come up with any type of mathematical description to just describe this is what happens, but there's nothing kind of over and above governing it. Do you want to address that now, or do you want to maybe table that and discuss it later?
Yeah, I think it's worth putting on the table now because so I mean I think you're right that the problem definitely kind of takes its sharpest form if we assume a governing conception of laws. So just for those who aren't too familiar with that, so in kind of the metaphysics of laws, people draw a distinction between governing views and non-governing views. One of the big non-governing views is the Humean view, which says like laws of nature aren't like they don't do things. It's not like the laws are somehow like what explains the regularities that we find in the world. Rather, laws are just kind of useful summaries that kind of summarize the regularities that happen to be in the world. So the thought is like the world is just a kind of like mosaic of qualities, and we find that there are kind of regular patterns in that mosaic, of that kind of four-dimensional mosaic of qualities, and we can kind of summarize or describe those patterns with generalizations, and the laws are just kind of the generalizations that kind of compress information about the universe in the kind of like most informationally compressed useful way. If you think of laws along those lines, then it doesn't really make sense to suppose that there could be laws that somehow fail to correspond to the actual properties that we find in the world,
Mm-hmm.
because laws just are kind of like useful general summaries of the patterns of property instantiations that we find in the
Mm-hmm.
world. So basically, I kind of want to concede that point, that that nomological harmony is not particularly puzzling from a Humean point of view. Maybe I'll have other things to say about Humeanism later. I think the problem is sharpest if we assume a kind of governing conception of laws, where on a governing conception of laws, you kind of think of laws as sort of not just useful summaries of the regularities that we find in the universe, but as sort of things that explain or ground or give rise to those regularities. So it's because there's a law that such and such is the case that the corresponding regularity holds. Sometimes people think of governing laws as somehow like kind of transcendent entities that sort of like influence or shape what happens in the concrete universe. There's different ways of thinking about them, but if you think of laws along governing lines, then I think that the problem of nomological harmony is takes its starkest form. Because I mean, it looks like there could have been laws saying massive bodies are to behave in thus and so way, but then the initial conditions of the universe don't have any massive bodies, in which case there's just kind of nothing for those laws to do.
Mm-hmm.
The universe would end up in a stillborn form. So I think like the main problem we look at, it's the biggest problem for, or it's at least the most interesting problem if you accept a governing conception of laws. We suggest that there are other problems kind of in the vicinity for other conceptions of laws, but yeah, it certainly takes its sharpest form for the governing view.
Okay. Maybe we can, at the end of the discussion, bring back Humeanism and see if there's uh, anything maybe lacking with the Humean explanation that might be worth pointing out. But for now, we'll just note this isn't particularly puzzling for the Humean, uh, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we've said laws a few times, but which class of laws are you focusing on in the paper?
Yeah, so the focus is on what we call dynamical laws. These are just laws that determine or constrain how the universe will evolve over time. So, I mean, the rough picture you can have in mind is something like, well, we start with the initial conditions of the universe, and then the dynamical laws tell us how, given the way things are at the initial state, the laws tell us how the universe is going to evolve forward from there. So if the laws are deterministic, then given the way things are at the beginning, there's only one way for things to kind of roll forward from there. If the laws are non-deterministic, then there might be multiple possibilities. But in any case, the laws will in some way constrain how the universe evolves given the initial conditions, or given the total way things are at a given time. Maybe the laws specify probabilities, or maybe they don't specify probabilities but provide certain constraints. But yeah, any kind of law of nature that determines or constrains how the universe changes dynamically over time. That's the kind of law we're concerned with, and mainly we frame the problem for convenience in terms of a match between the initial conditions in the laws. So let's just presuppose for convenience that the universe has initial conditions. It seems conceivable, at least on a governing conception of laws, that the initial conditions could fail to match the dynamical laws. So then in these terms, we'd pose the question as like, why is it that there's a match between the dynamical laws and the initial conditions? And it seems like there are many ways the laws could have been and the initial conditions could have been such that there wouldn't have been a match. Arguably, most ways they could have been would not have matched. So why is it that they match?
In the paper, you say that nomological harmony is unlikely, and that is a claim about probabilities. So what type of probabilities do you have in mind when you say that?
Yeah, so this can get into somewhat deep waters in thinking about probabilities, but I mean, basically, so one distinction we'd want to draw is between kind of like objective chances and something more either subjective or epistemic. And I'm not talking about objective chances. So when we say that absent some further story, nomological harmony would be unlikely, we're not saying that the objective chances of nomological harmony are low given absent some further explanation. The reason we wouldn't want to say that is it's normally assumed that that objective chances are themselves dependent on the laws of nature. And we're talking about the probabilities of the laws of nature being a certain way. And so, we want some kind of probability. We want to make sense of the idea that we can talk about probabilities assigned to the laws of nature themselves. But if objective chances are determined by the laws of nature, then that kind of wouldn't make sense. So, I mean, we think of these as kind of so-called epistemic or evidential probabilities. So these are basically the probabilities that constrain rational credences. So we assume this is not completely subjective. It's not anything goes. So yeah, like there are like objective truths about what it's kind of rational to believe, conditional upon certain evidence. And we think that absent some kind of explanation for why the laws and the initial conditions would match, it seems improbable that they would, kind of in this epistemic sense. We're talking about the kinds of probabilities that would come up in like the fine-tuning argument. So when someone says that it's unlikely, given atheism or single universe atheism, that the fundamental constants would fall within the narrow life permitting range, they're not talking about objective chances, because we're talking about a feature of the fundamental laws and constants. We're talking about some other kind of like epistemic unlikelihood. That's the same idea that we're relying on in saying that nomological harmony would be improbable, conditional upon no further explanation for it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you can conceive of many different ways that there could have been a match or unmatched, and it seems like there's a lot more ways that it could be mismatched than a match.
It seems like there's just vastly more ways of having mismatched sets of laws and initial conditions than there are having matched sets of initial conditions and laws. In something like the same way that there's vastly more ways for two term papers to not perfectly match word for word, letter for letter, than there are for them to match word for word. And therefore, it's kind of improbable that two term papers would perfectly match if they were kind of produced independently or if there was no further story. That's the basic thought.
Now I want to get into the possible explanations or responses to this problem of nomological harmony. You say there's really only four, and those four exhaust the logical possibilities here.
Four options are what we call brutalism, ensemble solutions, third factor solutions, and prioritist solutions. So brutalism just says it's just a brute fact. There's no further explanation. Explanation needs to end somewhere. It ends here. The laws match the states. There's nothing further to be said. That's just how it is. The ensemble solutions, I think, are a little bit more interesting. They kind of are inspired by multiverse responses to the issue of cosmological fine tuning. So the thought is like maybe there's a vast set of laws, and most of them actually fail to match any actual things in the universe. But given that there's so many of them, it's unsurprising that some of them match. That's at least one version of the ensemble hypothesis. That's a bit like the multiverse solution to the problem of fine tuning, which says like, well, sure, it's improbable that any given universe would have its constants fall within the life permitting range. But if there's a large enough number of universes and they're sufficiently varied in the constant values that they take, then it's unsurprising that at least some of them would fall within the life permitting range. And then from there, it's kind of like observation selection effect leads us to say it's no surprise that we find ourselves in one of the life permitting universes, because there aren't living beings observing at all in the non-life permitting universes. Similar claim about observation selection effect can go, well, anyway, maybe I'll hold off on that. Anyway, the thought is if there's a large and varied enough either set of laws or maybe universes, maybe most of them are mismatched, but given a large enough set that it's kind of unsurprising that there would be a match. That's the ensemble solution. The third factor solution says there's some third factor that is something that doesn't depend on either the laws or the initial conditions, that somehow it's maybe kind of prior to both, that kind of biases those towards a match or somehow explains why they would match. So theism would be an example of a third factor explanation, but there are also other third factor explanations. And then the fourth is what we call the prioritist view, that says either the initial conditions somehow explain the laws in a way that generates a match, or vice versa. The laws somehow explain the initial conditions in a way that generates a match. And I mean, the point of the paper is just to present the problem. To the best of our knowledge, nobody has kind of noticed this as a problem, and kind of canvass candidate explanations or solutions to it. At the end, we kind of come down in favor tentatively of third factor solutions. Like, we think that they score the best on the balance sheet of costs and benefits, but it's not really the point of the paper to favor the third factor solutions. So I'm happy to talk here about why I kind of think those are the best.
So now let's maybe get into the challenges that you see for these, and maybe why you prefer the third factor one. So let's start with the brutalist response. So this one, there just is no explanation for the harmony, the nomological harmony here. What are some challenges you have for that sort of response?
Yeah, so this I think is like the least interesting response. Not to say that it's horribly implausible. It's just not too much to say. So I guess I think in general, if a fact seems both kind of striking and improbable in the absence of some further explanation, then those two factors together make it kind of call out for explanation, demand explanation, cry for explanation, in a way that makes it a significant theoretical cost not to give it an explanation. So improbability is not enough. So I've argued that absent some further story, nomological harmony is improbable, but there's lots of things that are improbable that don't seem to cry out for explanation. So like a monkey typing on a typewriter types some very random long string of gibberish. That's very improbable that you'd get exactly that string of gibberish, but it doesn't seem special in any way, and so it doesn't seem to cry out for explanation. Whereas if the monkey types a Shakespearean sonnet, then that exact sequence might have been equally improbable, without some further story, as the string of gibberish, but it does seem to cry for explanation. It kind of challenges our assumptions about the circumstances that led to the sequence of letters or whatever. And there are a lot of cases like this. So fine-tuning, I think, is another example. So maybe any values that the constants had taken would have been just as improbable as the values that they actually took, given a kind of like single universe atheist view. But not any value they would have taken would have called for explanation, because most values are not particularly special. But the values that they have taken are special, because those are, among the full range of values, they're values within the very tiny range that allows for life. And life just seems to be a kind of objectively special and interesting thing. So that's why kind of fine-tuning for life is the sort of thing that seems to many people to cry for explanation in a way that any other equally improbable thing wouldn't cry for explanation. So, there's tons of examples like this, flipping a coin 100 times heads versus any other sequence. Like 100 heads seems both special and improbable, so it calls for explanation. Same goes, we think, for nomological harmony. Maybe any combination of, initial conditions and laws would have been just as improbable as the ones we got, but most of them wouldn't have been matching. The fact that ours match and that it's improbable that there would be a match kind of has those two ingredients that make it cry out for explanation. So that's kind of briefly why we think the brutalist view is not particularly attractive at the get-go.
Let's move to the ensemble solutions.
It might help to just look at kind of 2 or 3 different versions of the ensemble view. So one version just says, look, you were surprised that, there's a match because there's massive bodies and there's laws saying how massive things should behave. Like, what are the odds that we get a match like that? But that's actually not so surprising if, in addition to laws about how massive things behave, there's also just a ton of other laws, like how schmassive things are to behave, how schmarge things are to behave. Laws kind of applying to tons and tons of possible things, most of which don't actually exist. If there's a large enough set of actual laws, then it starts to look unsurprising that at least some of the laws apply to the actual contents of the universe. So that's one version of the ensemble view, that there's just kind of like one universe with one set of initial conditions, but tons and tons of laws, so many that it's unsurprising that some of them would kind of match the actual contents and kind of roll the universe forward in some interesting way. Another version is maybe there's just one set of laws, laws about mass and charge and a handful of other things, but basically what we ordinarily think of when we think of kind of fundamental physical laws. But there's a vast multiverse with lots of different properties at the initial conditions. Well, if there's a big enough set of initial conditions across distinct universes, then it's no surprise that at least one of them would have properties that find a match with the actual set of laws. And then again, observation selection effect comes in. No surprise that we find ourselves in one of the worlds where there's a match, because nothing interesting happens in the stillborn universes where there's not a match. And so observers are only going to exist in the universes that turn out to match the laws. And then there's another story that looks a bit more like the kind of traditional multiverse story for cosmological fine-tuning, where maybe there's just a bunch of universes and each universe has its own kind of pairing of initial conditions and laws. And maybe most of these are mismatched, but given a large enough set of universes, it's no surprise that some of them at least would happen to match. Just like if you're kind of like randomly throwing game pieces in with rule books, given a big enough game shop, you'd probably happen to find one box where the rule book matched the game pieces, even though most don't. And then again, you bring in the observation selection effect and say, well, no surprise that we find ourselves in one of the universes where there's a match, because in the other universes, nothing interesting happens, so there aren't any observers at all. So those are the 3 main kinds of ensemble theories.
What are some challenges you see for that response to the nomological harmony?
Yeah, good. So the big one is just going to be a concern about parsimony. So there are different flavors of parsimony that people care about when they're trying to, when they say that it's a theoretical virtue to have a parsimonious theory. But here are 2 different kinds of parsimony that I think are really important. One is so-called qualitative parsimony, like parsimony in like the fundamental kinds or the fundamental properties that you take to be instantiated in reality. And another is nomological parsimony, that is kind of having a simple set of fundamental laws. I kind of think nomological parsimony is probably the most important kind of parsimony. Like we want our basic explanatory laws to be as simple and tidy as possible. That's kind of, what when we're doing fundamental physics and we dream of a unified theory that just relies on a simple set of basic laws, like we're aspiring towards something like nomological parsimony. But notice that at least many of the ensemble views that I describe are extremely unparsimonious nomologically. So take the first one where there's this huge set of fundamental laws. So not just the stuff that physicists talk about, like laws about mass and charge and a few other things, but also laws about Schmass and laws about Schmarge and laws about countless other properties that turn out not to be instantiated. These are among the set of fundamental laws governing our reality. It just so happens that they don't have any things to govern the way that the mass laws do, but they are among the set of laws. So the set of rock bottom, absolutely basic laws on this picture is just extremely, extremely vast. So it's like as far as you could possibly get from the theoretical ideal of a like grand unified theory of physics that only relies on like one or two or three or small number of simple tidy laws. So there's just like a huge problem with nomological parsimony. Um, Other versions of the view have problems with qualitative parsimony. So take the version of the view that says that there's a bunch of different universes. Some of them have massive things, some of them have schmassive things, some of them have charged things, some of them have schmarged things. And, there's just like countless fundamental properties distributed across all these different universes. Well, here are the set of fundamental properties or fundamental kinds, concrete kinds, is just much, much vaster than we would have thought. So, maybe we thought we could get away with just like electrons and quarks and a few other fundamental kinds, but no, on this ensemble view, there's schmelectrons and schmorks and all these kind of fundamental kinds and fundamental properties. So in qualitative respects, the view is about as unparsimonious as you can get. So those are kind of the two most important kinds of theoretical parsimony, I think. And all versions of the ensemble view are just extremely unparsimonious, either in nomological respects or in qualitative respects, or both.
So, what if somebody says this, like, well, it actually strikes me that this is a very kind of simple solution. It is parsimonious because I'm putting no limits on the laws. So it's rather than be like, well, there's this many types of laws, but this other sort doesn't exist. It's like, no, they all exist. All the laws exist. There's something very simple about that. There's no limit on it. So what do you think? What do you think about that sort of response? And you can parody that with the initial, like, I'm not putting a limit on what sort of initial conditions exist. They all exist.
Yeah, no, I think there's something attractive about that line of thought. I mean, there's a way to take that kind of brings you all the way to something like David Lewis's modal realism, and all the things I just said about parsimony would seem to apply to Lewis's modal realism to some extent. But I mean, I can get the intuition that even though there's all this stuff and all these fundamental properties and all these different kinds, there's something very tidy and parsimonious just about a plenitude principle that says all possibilities are realized. So yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that thought. One issue that comes up in the paper is like, take the version where there's lots of different possible all these different laws. So many that it's unsurprising that some of them would match the initial conditions of our universe. There's an issue about on that kind of view there. Why wouldn't there be conflicting laws? That is, laws that dictate kind of incompatible evolutions from our initial conditions. Apparently there aren't conflicting laws. There's like one set of laws that prevails. We don't get like incompatible evolutions from a given state of the world. But like if there are so many, like you'd kind of expect that. Just like if you had so start with like chess pieces and then just like think of all the possible rule books that tell you how chess pieces can move around. So one rule book will say that bishops move diagonally, another rule book will say they move horizontally, and so on. Like, okay, these are just going to like be incompatible sets of rules that dictate incompatible board evolutions. So there's a worry on the like multi-law views as to why we don't get conflicting laws or incompatible laws. So maybe I'll just leave it there. There are a lot of other kind of subtle issues that we get into in that section of the paper, but I think that's one worry.
Okay, so prioritist responses. Remind us what those are, and then some challenges you have with it.
Yeah, so the kind of abstract definition we give is, well, on a prioritist response, either the initial conditions somehow explain the laws in a way that generates a match, or the laws somehow explain the initial conditions in a way that generates a match. And then there's a pretty tedious discussion of just like a lot of different kinds of views that fit into the prioritist mold. But maybe I'll focus on what I take to be two of the most important, and that's the Humean version of prioritism and the powers version of prioritism. So I've already explained the Humean view of laws. Laws are just kind of useful compressed summaries of the patterns that happen to hold across the mosaic, the four-dimensional mosaic of qualities, across all of space and time. Um, and on this view, here I want to distinguish two things. On the Humean view, we could ask, first of all, why is the so I'm going to use this term Humean mosaic. This is a term that's used in the literature to refer to the kind of pattern of qualities across space and time. Why is the Humean mosaic such as to be described with laws at all? That is, why does the Humean mosaic fall into nice, tidy, regular patterns at all? And the second is, given that it does fall into regular patterns that can be described with these simple generalizations, why is it that those laws match the states of the universe? The second question, that's the question of nomological harmony, and that's just not puzzling at all on the Humean view, because given that there are regularities concerning the pattern of qualities in the Humean mosaic, of course they're going to be about that pattern of qualities, and so they're going to match by definition. But the first question, which is a kind of more traditional problem for humanism, I think is just a well a very significant objection to humanism, because on humanism, it's not like the laws kind of stand underneath the mosaic and form and shape the mosaic into exhibiting these nice regularities. Like there's nothing more basic than the mosaic. There's nothing more basic than the pattern of qualities. And we look around, and it happens that the qualities fall into these nice regular patterns that can be described with simple generalizations. But that just seems like a wild cosmic fluke, a cosmic coincidence. Like, why is it, first of all, that every portion of space and time exhibits the same regularities? And like, why are there tidy regularities at all? So maybe one way to think about this is like, think of just like a television screen. So it's, that corresponds to like all the different points of space and time. The television screen can have its pixels lit up with different colors. The vast majority of ways of lighting up the pixels on the television screen are not going to make it fall into neat regular patterns like black, white, black, white, black, white, or anything that could be captured in any clean generalizations at all. The vast majority of ways of lighting up those pixels is just going to be complete random, chaotic, static. And yet our world is not random, chaotic, static. Our world falls into these nice, neat, tidy patterns. But if there's nothing like more basic than the mosaic, then it just seems like a wild cosmic coincidence that the mosaic would be such as to be described with simple generalizations at all. So the way I kind of think about the relationship between that problem and nomological harmony is that, like, yes, the Humean doesn't have a problem with nomological harmony, but that's not really a reason to convert to Humeanism. Because if your reason because like we want to avoid the problem of nomological harmony because we want to avoid the idea that like this major coincidence has occurred, namely this fortunate match between laws and states. But you can avoid that coincidence by accepting Humeanism, but only by accepting what seems to me to be a much larger coincidence, namely the kind of striking regularity of the Humean mosaic that just doesn't have any further explanation on the Humean view. So that's why I think even though the Humean doesn't really face a difficult form of the problem of nomological harmony, I at least am not particularly attracted to to adopt Humeanism in response to this problem, because it kind of faces its own different and more serious cosmic coincidence problem.
What about the causal powers and liabilities view that you mentioned?
Good. So I've mentioned the governing view of laws. I've mentioned the Humean view of laws. The third main view of laws is that laws are kind of descriptions of or grounded in the causal powers of the concrete entities that exist in the universe. So the causal powers determined by their properties like mass. So the thought is like, um, you know, mass is essentially a disposition to attract other massive things, and the laws about like how massive bodies attract one another are just kind of descriptions of the essential causal powers of massive bodies is basically the thought. So on this view, if laws are just descriptions of the essential causal powers of things, there's there's not really a puzzle as to why the laws would match the contents of the universe, because they're just descriptions of the causal powers associated with the properties that are actually instantiated in the universe. So even though the powers view of laws, I think, doesn't really face the problem of nomological harmony as we formulate it, it does face, I think, an analogous problem. So the problem is basically like, why is it that the pattern of powerful qualities at the initial conditions are coordinated in such a way as to induce temporal evolution? So this is analogous to the problem of nomological harmony, but let me kind of illustrate with a sort of an example. So suppose that there are x's at the initial conditions, and x's have the causal power to push y's. Well, then nothing interesting is going to happen if there aren't any y's around at the initial conditions. Or suppose that there are x's at the initial conditions, and x's have the essential causal power of moving other x's when they stand in a certain Newtonian spatial relation. Well, if there are x's at the initial conditions, but they only stand in like relativistic spatial relations, then again, nothing interesting is going to happen. And in general, it's not enough to have things with causal powers, like where those properties essentially confer those causal powers. The initial conditions also need to be such that the stimulus conditions of those causal powers are met. And that's just a very non-trivial condition. So basically the problem becomes not why is there a match between the laws and the contents of the universe, but why are the powerful qualities in the universe harmoniously coordinated with one another in such a way as to kind of make anything interesting happen. There's tons and tons of ways of kind of arranging powerful qualities at the initial conditions that wouldn't lead anything to happen, that would lead to these kind of stillborn universes. So you do get a version of the problem even on the powers view, but the problem takes a somewhat different form.
In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move to third factor responses, because this is the one that in the end you end up favoring.
Yeah, so again, the third factor view says that there's some third factor in addition to the laws and the initial conditions that's kind of prior to both, that somehow biases those two other factors towards a match. One version of this might be versions that invoke some kind of meta law. So maybe there's just a meta law saying that dynamical laws and initial conditions must match. That could do it. Or maybe there's some kind of more general meta law that kind of says that the first order laws are need to have like meet some kind of like axiological condition, like maybe like we get the best possible first order laws. Maybe that could account for things like fine tuning for life or something like that. There's a bunch of different versions that we that we consider, but maybe the one that gets the most airtime is some kind of designer theistic hypothesis. So here God would play the role of the third factor, and whatever God's reasons are for creating a universe where anything interesting happens at all would be the explanation for why he makes laws and initial conditions match. So God by definition is supposed to be a perfectly good, all-powerful, all-knowing being. you would expect a being like that to act for the sake of the good, to create a universe of a kind that could realize value in various forms. And it looks like having matching laws and states is a precondition for just about any kind of value you can imagine, like a stillborn universe where nothing interesting happens at the initial conditions. That's just not going to be a world where basically anything of value exists. It's not going to be a world with life or consciousness or friendship or tacos or anything good. So like it's a being who has an interest in kind of acting for the good or the realization of value is one you would expect to ensure that laws and initial conditions match in a way that can make like anything interesting happen at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a version of the third factor view. One worry here is that, well, one worry that the referees had is, well, if you say it's a coincidence that the laws and states would match kind of brutally without further explanation, then isn't it a coincidence to say that God like chooses for them to match? Isn't that just kind of like moving the coincidence inside the decisions of God instead of just like out in the world with the laws and the states? And there, I don't find that to be a compelling line of response. Maybe, well, we can think of the analogy of fine tuning again. So, it's very natural to think that absent some kind of further explanation, if there's just a single universe, it would be a very striking coincidence if the actual parameter values for these physical parameters happen to correspond to the life permitting parameters. That just seems like a wild coincidence. Now you could say like, well, wouldn't it be equally a coincidence for, among all the different parameter values that God could choose, that he chose the parameter values that fall within the life permitting range? How is that any less of a coincidence? But there, I think, that's less of a coincidence because, it's the kind of outcome that you might reasonably expect given a perfect being who acts for the sake of the good. I mean, here you're gonna import some assumptions about the value of life or life being a precondition for other kinds of value, but those assumptions seem pretty unproblematic. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just like given the kind of axiological assumptions just built into the theistic hypothesis, it just doesn't strike me as anything like a coincidence that God would choose to make matching laws and states rather than any number of mismatched laws and states. I mean, I think you can make a similar point when it comes to just like agent-based explanations of anything whatsoever. So suppose I see a bunch of Scrabble tiles laid out and they spell out, oh, that this 2-2 solid flesh would melt and thaw and resolve itself into a dew. And yeah, it's this nice line from Shakespeare, and we think like, oh, it'd be a massive coincidence if they just happened to be arranged like that without anyone intentionally arranging them. And so I posit that like some human being intentionally arranged them in that order. Like it would be weird to respond by saying like, well, but isn't that just as much of a coincidence that the human being chose to say that rather than any of the other many arrangements that they could have done? And like, I just think that objection just doesn't get any traction. The way Roger White responds to this kind of worry is like, well, like having a meaningful message like that is just like a plausible purpose for an agent. That's what makes that a satisfying explanation for the meaningful arrangement of letters. And similarly, like matching laws and states is just a plausible purpose for a good being or a good agent like God to have. And that's what makes it a kind of satisfying explanation that removes the appearance of a coincidence. So anyway, I think that response is successful.
We've got just a few minutes left. What about challenges for that meta law view? Like there has to be matches, or that kind of axiarchism type view where it's like we gotta have matches for the good or something like that.
One thing that's attractive about, say, theism against like just a really flat-footed meta law view that says it's just a law that laws and states match, is that theism, at least potentially, has explanatory power beyond this very specific explanandum of nomological harmony. I mean, this is getting a little bit beyond the paper, but just bring in like anything that you might think theism could fruitfully explain, like fine tuning or anything else, psychophysical harmony or whatever. If God kind of provides a unified explanation of this together with other things that seem to you to cry out for explanation, then that's going to be a theoretical advantage over the kind of piecemeal approach where I give like one explanation for fine tuning and then a different explanation for nomological harmony and then a different for psychophysical harmony and so on. So one point we make in favor of like some of the ensemble views is they promise to explain both nomological harmony and cosmological fine-tuning in one theoretical stroke. And we think that's a virtue, because you're going to have to say something about cosmological fine-tuning. And so like a multiverse view that both explains nomological harmony and also, by the way, accounts for cosmological fine-tuning, like that gives a kind of unified explanation of disparate puzzling phenomena in a way that's a theoretical virtue. And we make the same point about third factor hypotheses like theism and like axiarchism, that these at least can potentially explain puzzling facts about fine tuning in addition to nomological harmony. That gives them a kind of like unified explanatory power that makes them look more attractive than more ad hoc solutions that just explain nomological harmony.
I did an interview with Thomas Metcalf and Tyler Hildebrand on a nomological argument for the existence of God. If you enjoyed this video, I would almost guarantee you that you'll enjoy that video, so check that out. Thank you for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.